Hello, fellow birders. My name is Denis Kania. Today we're going to be taking a look at what birds we might encounter if we plan a field trip to McKee Marsh in the summertime. On the DuPage Birding Club education channel, we talk about all things bird related. As I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about what birds we might encounter if we go birding at McKee Marsh in the summer. So there's many ways that we can prepare for an excursion like this, and probably one of the easiest things that you could do would be to look at eBird and look at the hotspot that's located in Blackwell Forest Preserve, and it's indicated as McKee Marsh. So if we do that, we'll get an opportunity to look at that data in different ways. And what I choose to do quite often is to look at it in the bar chart format, which you see right here. And then if we're going to go out in June, we can look at this column for June, and it's broken down into 4 weeks. And you can determine which birds you might encounter in that part of the year. So quite often in my classes at the Morton Arboretum, I tell my students that the best time to prepare for what birds you're going to see is before you even get out into the field. That's the best time to be looking in your field guide to solve your problems that you might have in identification. The only way that you can do that is by anticipating what birds you might see on your field trip. And that can be difficult to do. But using a tool such as eBird, you can at least get a list of the birds that people are seeing at the park or preserve that you plan to visit. So that's what I've done here for McKee Marsh. And again, I'm looking at just a column for June. And so I can determine, which birds I might encounter at McKee Marsh in June. And if you do that, you'll find out that there's about 80 species of birds that you can encounter. So that narrows things down, and now we can actually have a list, and we can start to look at those birds in the field guides if there are birds in that list that you're unfamiliar with. And let's say you have some issues with how to tell one species from another. Well, the time to sort all of those issues out and to determine what you should be looking at to make those separations, the best time to do that is before you go in the field. And I often say this, and I know that can be difficult for newer birders, especially when you're going to go out to McKee Marsh, and it's a very large preserve, and it's quite diverse in terms of habitat. And so where are you going to encounter certain species? And for a new birder, that's difficult to figure out. So I thought it would be beneficial, and that's why we're doing this video today, is to take a little tour around McKee Marsh, just as an example. And I chose McKee Marsh because it is very diverse. There's quite a few different habitats that we'll encounter as we work our way around the marsh. And so I'll do my best to try and give you a heads up on what birds you might find and where you might find them. So we're going to start out, of course, at the parking lot. And quite often you're already going to start encountering birds there. And these are going to be most often non-specific habitat species. So species that can get along quite well just about anywhere. And that will include a lot of common birds that you're probably already familiar with. Things like mourning doves and European starlings, American robins, American goldfinch, red-winged blackbirds, brown-headed cowbirds, common grackles. These are all things that you can expect to find right off the parking lot, right when you get out of your car. And of course, you can also encounter these birds further on as we explore McKee Marsh. But these are birds that you'll come up with right away. And there will be actually a couple of species that you will see in and around the parking lot, and that might be your only opportunity to see them because they do like this kind of open parkland habitat with mowed lawns and spaced out trees. And that's the kind of habitat that you're looking at when you first get out of the car. And so there's a couple things like chipping sparrows and house sparrows. Once you get into the preserve, you're probably less likely to locate these birds. So if you want to see those birds, this is the right place to be looking for them. But do keep in mind that birds may not interpret habitats and their boundaries the same way that we do. So you're going to possibly be encountering birds in places that you may not expect them. So be prepared for some surprises. As we make our way into the preserve, there's an entry trail that takes us out to the main loop that goes around the marsh. And on our way through there, we're going to be working our way through some habitat that is kind of secondary habitat, woodland habitat in nature. There's a variety of trees growing along the edges here. There's a lot of scrubby areas. And intermixed between all of that, you do have grasslands and some prairie plants that are emerging as well. Early on, when I first started birding at McKee Marsh, this is many, many, many years ago, we didn't have all of these trees, and you were basically walking past more of a prairie habitat, but that has changed over the years. And so now the birds that you're going to encounter are quite different than what I would have seen 30 years ago. And the things that we can anticipate seeing in this area would be things like ruby-throated hummingbird, gray catbird, eastern bluebird, cedar waxwing, eastern towhee, common yellowthroat, and northern cardinal. And again, these are all birds that are pretty common, and you're probably familiar with most of them. So there shouldn't be any big surprises here, but I did put a few photos here just so you can get a feel for some of these species. Here's cedar waxwing, and here's eastern bluebird and common yellowthroat. If you're unfamiliar with some of these species or any of the others listed here, you can look those up in your field guide before you even get out into the field. That would be a good idea so that you can anticipate what you should be looking for in the field. So again, in a mixed habitat like this, where it's kind of secondary growth, you can anticipate seeing all these species that I've listed here. And you can encounter them again in other habitats as we make our way around the marsh. Again, these birds aren't tied to just very specific places. Some of them have specific requirements, but a lot of them are generalists as well. And most of what we've listed here are going to be more or less general in nature and will utilize different habitats. But this would be certainly a good place to find these species as we start our walk. Once we get to the main loop that goes all the way around the marsh, the first thing that we're going to encounter, whether we take the trail to the right and go counterclockwise, or if we take it to the left and go clockwise, in either case, we're going to encounter a lot of cottonwoods. And this is a great place to be looking for things like Baltimore orioles or warbling vireos. They both like to nest in those kinds of trees. And so we can anticipate finding them there. And I have thrown a couple of photos here so you can see a Baltimore oriole, and here's a warbling vireo. In the case of our walk today, we're actually going to go counterclockwise. So we're going to make a right-hand turn on that trail. And as we walk along, we're going to have a view of the marsh itself. And there's a pond out there. There's usually water in this pond. And I actually have a video showing what this area looks like. And so there's actually a little observation blind that you can utilize in order to view the wetland from this section. And so you'll see there's a lot of cattails in the front, and you can see much open water here. So quite often you'll have waterfowl out there. In the summertime, that waterfowl would consist of Canada goose, wood ducks, blue-winged teal, and mallard. And you might even have pied-billed grebes breeding out here in June. In different seasons, of course, the number of waterfowl species could increase considerably, but this is what we're going to see in June. As we leave that blind and continue to work our way around the perimeter of the wetland, we're going to encounter a small woodlot on our right. And so this woodlot is an example of many small woodlots that we'll encounter as we work our way around. And so some of the species that we anticipate seeing in a woodlot like this would be red-bellied or downy or hairy woodpeckers. You could also find great-crested flycatchers, blue jays, black-capped chickadees, white-breasted nuthatches, blue-gray gnatcatchers, house wrens, rose-breasted grosbeak, and indigo buntings. All of those like to utilize these woodlots, especially on the edges. And so even if a woodlot is not very large, it's still providing that woodland edge that a lot of these species prefer. And so we can encounter those even in small woodlots. Here's another example. In this case, we have some woodland on either side of the trail. And here are some of those species that I just mentioned. Here's a rose-breasted grosbeak, which is very recognizable. Great-crested flycatcher. Again, as far as our flycatchers go, it's a very large one and quite brightly colored compared to most of our other flycatchers. And here we have indigo bunting, house wren, and blue-gray gnatcatcher. So all those are species that we could anticipate finding in these smaller woodlots. If we work our way up the trail a little further, we'll find a little spur trail that leads to the leads right to the marsh. And so from that overview, we get another panoramic view of that same wetland that we were looking at a minute ago, but the vantage point will allow us to see some of these other areas way further to the back. And when we're looking around here, there are lots of birds that might pop up. We can see soras and Virginia rails, especially at this time of year as the water levels start to decrease. Some of these edges will have mudflats. And those are places that if you get out pretty early in the morning, you could find soras or Virginia rails foraging. You can also find things like American coots and kildares, spotted sandpipers, double-crested cormorants, great blue herons, great egrets, green herons, black-crowned night herons, marsh wrens in the cattails up here in the foreground, and also swamp sparrows would be in that area as well. So here are some examples of those birds that I mentioned. Here's our kildare, and we could easily see some of those foraging around on these mudflats. Double-crested cormorants, quite often we'll find a perch somewhere along in this area here, as will green herons. My last trip out to McKee Marsh, we did have green herons out here. And again, as I mentioned, in the foreground where we have all the cattails, that's a good place to find marsh wrens and swamp sparrows. Those won't be the only sparrows that you'll find in this area, but certainly that's probably the key place to be looking for swamp sparrows on a visit to McKee Marsh. And of course, we need to look skyward as well. And swallows are going to be seen almost all over the place as we make our way around the marsh. But most often we'll see them over the marsh or over the grasslands. And so I wanted to take a moment just to mention the different swallows that we might encounter. Probably the most common would be the tree swallow. And you'll see it's very dark on the back. And you'll find that if we could see the full view of the underside, it's just very, very white. Barn swallow is also dark on the back. But you do have a very, very dark throat area, and then it kind of gets to be a buffy wash on the breast, or on the breast and belly. So the coloration wise, on the upper parts it'll look similar to a tree swallow, but the under parts are quite different. And the tail structure is different, where when this tail is closed off, it's going to look very squared off, where barn swallows are going to look very deeply notched. In some cases, you'll even have the long tails coming out like a swallowtail. And then a third swallow species we may encounter is northern ruffling swallow. And it's going to be very pale brown on the back and then whitish below with a very dingy throat area. And again, squared off tail. So those would be the main swallows that we'd expect when we're viewing areas around McKee Marsh. As we continue further down the trail, you'll find an area on your right that is a flooded area that for a very long time has had dead cottonwoods in there. This is a great place. If there's water in here, you could find wood ducks sitting on some of the logs down in the water. You could also, in the edges, you could find those Virginia rails and soras. They will forage around in these areas as well. But the main thing to be looking for here in all of these dead trees are some of the woodpeckers that show up. And we can have red-headed woodpecker, red-bellied woodpecker. I've seen downy woodpeckers here, northern flickers, but European starlings and tree swallows are also going to use these nesting cavities. So this can be a very, very active area. It's worth standing around and watching for a while because the birds will be in and out of those nest holes. Here's maybe something that you wouldn't expect to find at McKee Marsh when you're thinking about a marsh, but there is, as I mentioned, quite a few different habitats located as we make our way around. And so there are some extensive grassland areas, which we can see here. And open areas like this with grasslands are going to be suitable for eastern kingbirds for foraging. And then we'll also find sedge wrens and savanna sparrows, Henslow sparrows, and song sparrows all nesting out here, as well as bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks. And this summer in particular, as we've been going out, I've been taking arboretum classes out here, and we've been getting a Henslow sparrow up on these stems out in this area right here. So that would be an area to watch for Henslow sparrows. Not a species that I find out here very often, but this year we've had them performing quite well, and they've actually been getting up and singing from a singing perch that is exposed quite often Henslow sparrows like to just sit down in the grass, and you'll hear them, but you'll never get to see them. So you just have to use some patience, and eventually with enough visits, you'll find them up where you can get a good look at them. So here are some of those species that we just talked about. Here's our eastern kingbird. It's very recognizable, all white underneath, very dark above. In some cases, especially if you see tree swallows perched, it might make you think of that bird. However, if we look at the end of the tail, you'll see that there's a terminal white band here. So that's how you would recognize that species. Eastern meadowlarks are very recognizable with yellow below and then that black collar. Here's our Henslow Sparrow. It's a very smart looking sparrow, very olivey in the face, a large bill, very flat-headed look to it. It does have a buffy wash across the breast and some fine streaking here. So you're very lucky if you get to see that bird, but it is a very nice bird to see when you do find it. Same with sedge herons. Quite often they'll be singing, but they'll be singing down in the grasses where you can't get a good look at them. Very seldom will they pop up where you can get a good look, but they are out there. And bobolinks are very noticeable. They do like to fly around a lot over their territories, and they're vocalizing quite a bit, so it should be easy to find those species or those birds. Quite often adjacent to some of these open grassland areas, we'll find some scrubby areas with a lot of brush. And so here we have a little island of gray dogwoods, and those will be very popular with things like willow flycatcher and yellow warbler. Both of those species really like to nest in these kinds of habitats. You'll see some larger bushes as well, and if you have some adjacent tree lines, now you're getting even more opportunity for some other species like orchard oriole and brown thrasher. Field sparrows would also be found in this kind of habitat. So again, you're looking at areas that are adjacent to our open grasslands, and you're starting to encounter more of a scrubby area like this. As we make our way all the way around the wetland, as we get onto the western edge, we're going to find a very large woodlot. And so some of these larger woodlands will support species like yellow-billed cuckoo and eastern wood pewee, red-eyed vireo, wood thrush, and scarlet tanager. That pewee in particular likes to get into these gallery areas where it's kind of open in the woodlands and you have a lot of tree snags, and that's where you're going to find that pewee. They'll get out on these perches and they utilize those to watch over their territory as well as to use them for foraging. So kind of watch out for those opportunities. And some of these birds can even overlap into some of those other smaller woodlots that we talked about. Where I've been mostly hearing wood thrushes this year has not been in the major woodlots, but actually in one of the smaller ones. So there can be some overlap as far as habitat utilization by these species. And here are some of those birds. Here's our eastern wood pewee. And here's red-eyed vireo, which you seldom get to see. You're looking for this olivey green bird that's sitting way up in the canopy, and they certainly sing a lot, and it's easy to hear them and locate what area they're in, but actually finding the bird can be quite difficult. Wood thrushes, same thing, they'll sing, but it's very, very hard to locate them. Even worse with yellow-billed cuckoos. And then we also have the scarlet tanager that will nest in the woodlands, or as I like to call it, the black-winged redbird. I'm sure at some point in time that's going to catch on. I keep pushing it. As we get close to completing our loop around the wetland, we're going to come to the southwest corner now, and that jumped on me, sorry. And in this corner, you'll see that there's an exit pipe where water leaves the wetland. And this area, when on a normal year where we have a lot of rain, this would be quite wet in this area. This year, of course, we're kind of struggling through a drought, and so we don't have a lot of water here. But this is a great place to look for Virginia rails and soras. In fact, my life rails, both Sora and Virginia, came from this little area right over here many, many, many years ago. Historically, this was actually a good place to look for least bitterns as well. I don't know if anybody is finding those there anymore, but this area, even if there's just a little bit of water and you have mudflats forming in this area, it's a great place to look for both of these rails. So keep that in mind. And while we're making our way all the way around, I do again want to mention that you should keep your eyes skyward. We talked about swallows flying above all over the place. We can also have things like chimney swifts. ospreys, turkey vultures, red-tailed hawks, and ring-billed gulls. And there are probably other birds that could show up as well. You could get Cooper's hawk, you could probably get Caspian terns on occasion, but I've tried to keep our list of birds down to those birds that are most commonly seen. And that was dictated by what I was reading off of the bar graph that I had on iBet for as a hotspot. So that's what we've tried to cover here. We've only covered species that are most likely to be found at McKee Marsh in June and in reasonable numbers. So if you do a little bit of research, you can compile that list, same as I did. I ended up with about 80 species that I considered probably regularly occurring birds in June at McKee Marsh. And of course, that's utilizing quite a few different habitats. But do keep in mind that those habitats can overlap somewhat, and birds don't read the habitats the same way that we do, so you can be prepared for the unexpected. But hopefully this will give you a leg up on your next adventure out at McKee Marsh, and you'll start to have an idea of where to look for certain species as you make your way around the marsh. So thanks for taking the time to view this video. Hopefully we have given you some bird food for thought. And I hope that you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.